In the last video, we read about the harmful effects of globalization on the developing countries who have to pay very heavily. Globalization has made the developing countries a dumping ground of the developed nations, violating all human rights and exposing them to all environmental hazards. World Trade Organization and International Monetary Fund to support them, ignoring the very core of their inception, that is, to help the developing countries. We also read how our traditional methods of farming are any day better as they give a sumptuous produce and do not deplete the soil or harm the environment. Before we begin reading further, let's understand what prions are. Prions are misfolded proteins with the ability to transmit their misfolded shape onto normal variants of the same protein. They characterize several fatal and transmissible neurodegenerative diseases in humans and many other animals. The word prion is derived from protein and infection, hence prion. All known prion diseases in mammals affect the structure of the brain or other neural tissue. All are progressive, have no known effective treatment, and are always fatal. All known prion diseases are untreatable and deadly. The prionization of culture. Culture is the core of society, the embodiment of values and norms, of meaning and interpretation. It is a positive lived experience, and as positive identity, cultural diversity can coexist in peace. However, the stresses and pressures of globalization change positive identities into negative identities, much like the prions, the distorted proteins, which were identified as causing the mad cow disease when cows were fed with carcasses of diseased cows. Much as a prion becomes a self-infecting agent, the prionized cultures become self-infecting agents in society. Cultural identity is established on the core values shared on a living society. These values includes language, dressing style, way of talking, habits, and many others. The century of globalization, where all the societies with different culture live together, is the 20th 21st century. Mostly, Western civilization is sweeping away the traditions and culture of the society, affecting changes in the behavior and thinking of people of different societies. On one hand, globalization has the potential to mobilize and empower people, provide a means for self representation, support a collective identity through socialization, and provide employment opportunities. On the other hand, it has the ability to disempower people by misrepresentation, provide a process for further colonization, and propel the loss of individualism and self and group identity. The spread of economic globalization has gone hand in hand with the rise of exclusivist philosophies and ideologies. Underlying the exclusivist philosophies of the fundamentalist market ideology and religious ideology is the polarization of identity. As Amy Chua discusses in her book World on Fire, the economic polarization of globalization is superimposed on existing class inequalities. These class inequalities frequently mirror ethnic patterns. Class conflicts, she argues, thus get camouflaged as ethnic conflicts. Amy Chua, in her book The World on Fire, is talking about a situation where a developing nation has a majority of people mired in poverty and misery, where a small and very wealthy elite dominates trade and capital in that country, and where the poor and the elite comprise differentiated groups with pre-existing history of mutual suspicion, hate, and oppression. The book is an insightful and incisive commentary on Western foreign policy that truly exemplifies how the road to hell is paved with the best of intentions. As diverse cultures experience a threat to their values, norms, and practices by globalization, there is a cultural backlash. When the cultural response does not simultaneously defend economic democracy and create living economies, it takes the form of negative identities and negative cultures. There are a number of negative impacts globalization has had on cultural diversity, including the influence multinational corporations have on promoting a consumer culture, exploitation of workers and markets, and influencing societal values. This increased availability of commercial media and products can drown out local cultural influences. The present education, legal, and power structures reflect Western ideas and philosophies. These Western ideas are easily assimilated into other cultures and paradigms with far reaching effects. There is an assumption that the values and ideologies of the global North will provide a suitable framework for the new knowledge economies of the developing global south. Globalization allows further colonization, which impacts cultural property and cultural rights. Culture and economy are inseparable. The neoliberal ideology of development and globalization wishes culture away, yet culture dominates and becomes the surrogate for concerns over livelihoods and economic security. Fundamentalists' religion becomes, as Marx so aptly observed, an opiate of the masses. True, globalization has various manifestations. If viewed strictly from economic terms, then the debate delves into trade barriers, protectionism, and tariffs. Powerful countries demand that smaller countries break down all trade barriers while maintaining a level of protectionism over their own. Smaller countries, knowing that they cannot do much to hide from the hegemonic nature of globalization, form their own economic clubs, hoping to negotiate fairer deals. And the economic tug of war continues between diplomacy and threats, dialogue and arm twisting. This is the side of globalization with which most of us are familiar. But there is another side of globalization, one that is similarly detrimental to some countries and profitable to others: cultural globalization. Not necessarily the domination of a specific culture, in this case, Western culture, over all the rest, but rather the unbridgeable disadvantage of poorer countries who lack the means to withstand the unmitigated takeover of their own traditional ways of life by the dazzling, well packaged, and branded culture imparted upon them around the clock. What audiences watch, read, and listen to in most countries outside the Western Hemisphere is not truly Western culture in the strict definition of the term. It's a selective brand of culture, a reductionist presentation of art, entertainment, news, and so on as platforms to promote ideas that would ultimately sell products. For the dwarfed representation of Western culture, it's all about things, tangible material values that can be obtained by that simple and final act of pulling out one's credit card. To sell a product, however, media also sell ideas, often one sided, and create unjustifiable fascinations with ways of life that hardly represent natural progression for many vanishing cultures and communities around the world. The concrete context of culture, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the languages we speak, the faiths we hold, is the source of our human identity. However, economic globalization has hijacked culture, reducing it to a consumerist monoculture of McDonald's and Coca Cola on the one hand, and negative identities of hate on the other. Peace and sustainability need society to move to a paradigm beyond economic globalization. There is nothing wrong with exchanges of ideas, of course. Cultural interactions are historically responsible for much of the great advancements and evolution in art, science, language, even food, and much more. But prior to globalization, cultural influences were introduced at much slower speed. It allowed societies, big and small, to reflect, consider, and adjust to these unique notions over time. But the globalization of the media is unfair. It gives no chance for mulling anything over, for determining the benefits or the harms, for any sort of value analysis. News, music, and even pornography are beamed directly to all sorts of screens and gadgets. Globalization is not a fair game, of course. Those with giant economies get the lion's share of the collective decision making. Those with more money and global outlook tend to have influential media, also with global outlook. In both scenarios, small countries are lost between desperately trying to negotiate a better economic standing for themselves while hopelessly trying to maintain their cultural identity, which defined their people generation after generation throughout history.